If nobody wants to sit with him, I will, Nia Brooks said, and for a second even the cafeteria seemed to stop breathing. The room was full of the usual lunchroom noise before that, metal chair legs dragging over tile, milk cartons popping open, little bursts of laughter bouncing under the bright fluorescent lights. But her small voice cut through it clean and soft. 9 years old, brown hands wrapped around a paper lunch bag folded twice at the top. Nia stood beside the long table near the windows where the fourth graders always sat, her backpack slipping off one shoulder, her braids tied with blue ribbons her mother had ironed flat that morning. Across from her, Ethan Cole sat alone with a sealed tray he had not touched. The slice of pizza had gone stiff at the edges. The baby carrots were still lined up in the plastic corner exactly the way the lunch lady had dropped them there. He stared through the glass, past the playground, past the chain-link fence, as if whatever he was looking for lived somewhere far beyond the blacktop. Everybody in the school knew Ethan Cole, not because he talked much. He hardly talked at all. They knew him because black SUVs picked him up every afternoon, because his last name was on a hospital wing downtown, because his father was on magazine covers smiling beside words like visionary and billionaire and empire. But none of that mattered much to Nia in that moment. What she saw was a boy sitting by himself with both hands tucked under the table like he was trying to disappear. She slid onto the bench across from him before anyone could stop her. Her lunch was small enough to fit in 2 palms, half a turkey sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a handful of pretzels in a sandwich bag, and 6 apple slices gone slightly brown at the corners. Her mother had packed it before sunrise, when the apartment kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and dish soap, and the radiator hissed like it was clearing its throat. Nia unwrapped the sandwich slowly, then split it down the middle with careful fingers. One half she kept, the other she pushed across the table toward Ethan. He blinked, but did not look up. "You can have this part," she said. "My mama says food tastes better when somebody doesn't. Eat alone." A few kids at the next table turned to stare. A blonde girl with a glitter lunchbox frowned. One of the room moms standing near the juice cooler glanced over, then glanced again when she saw what Nia was doing. It was the kind of look adults gave when they thought something was sweet and sad at the same time. Nia ignored it. She pushed the pretzels forward too, then the apple slices, leaving herself the smallest piece of bread and 2 pretzels crushed near the bottom of the bag. Ethan's fingers moved at last, barely, like the gesture itself cost him something. He touched the edge of the wax paper, then let his hand fall back. Nia leaned in just a little. "You don't have to talk," she told him. "I'm just saying you can eat." Around them, the cafeteria noise returned in pieces, but softer now, as if the room had decided to listen without making it obvious. At the far end of the table, one boy whispered, "Why is she giving him her food?" Another shrugged. A parent volunteer murmured under her breath, "That child barely has enough for herself." Nia heard it. She heard everything. She was used to adults lowering their voices right after they looked at her shoes, or her lunch, or the elbows of her sweater polished shiny with wear. But she kept smiling anyway, small and calm, the kind of smile that made her look older than 9. The sunlight from the high cafeteria windows touched one side of her face, warm and pale, and lit the tiny scratch on her lunch bag where she had written her name in purple marker. Ethan's eyes flicked to it. "Nia." He stared at the letters for a long moment like names still mattered in a world that had gone quiet on him. Then, very slowly, he reached for the half sandwich. The room did not gasp, but it came close. Ms. Harper, carrying a stack of worksheets near the entrance, actually stopped walking. The lunch monitor lowered her clipboard. Ethan had refused cafeteria food for weeks, maybe months, nibbling crackers some days, pushing full trays away on others, wrapped so tightly in his silence that even the teachers spoke about him in careful voices. But now he picked up the sandwich Nia had handed him and held it there, both hands around it, as if it were something breakable and strange and important. Nia took her own tiny piece and bit into it like this was the most ordinary thing in the world. Peanut butter breath drifted from the kindergarten table nearby. Someone dropped a spoon. Outside, a yellow school bus rolled past the far fence in a slow blur. Ethan took one bite. Just one. But it was enough to make Ms. Harper press her hand lightly to her chest. Nia looked at him, then down at the table, giving him the kindness of not turning his hunger into a performance. That was when she noticed the gold charm lying near his tray, a small polished piece no bigger than a quarter, engraved and gleaming against the scratched gray tabletop. Ethan's fingers brushed it once, protectively, before closing around it. Nia said nothing. She only watched the way his shoulders eased, just a little, under the bright cafeteria lights. And somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the school and the city and the buildings downtown with their mirrored sides, a man who had built his whole life on never forgetting hunger was about to learn the name of the little girl who had fed his son with half a sandwich and a heart too big for her paper lunch bag. By the time the lunch bell ended, the room had changed in a way no one could quite explain. It was still the same cafeteria with its bright white lights and scuffed tile floors and the faint smell of tomato sauce and bleach hanging in the air, but something in it had softened. Ethan Cole had eaten 3 bites of the sandwich, then 4, and though he had not said a word, he had not pushed the food away either. For Miss Harper, that alone felt like watching a locked window crack open after a long winter. She did not make a scene of it. She simply walked over, gathered the untouched lunch trays from the other end of the table, and let her eyes rest on Nia for one brief second with a look that carried more gratitude than surprise. Nia did not seem to notice. She was folding the wax paper neatly into a square the way her mother taught her, careful not to leave crumbs behind, careful not to waste. Ethan still sat across from her, one hand near the little gold charm on the table, the other resting beside the sandwich as if he did not yet trust the moment enough to move too quickly inside it. Then the shrill buzz of the dismissal bell cut through the room. Chairs scraped back. Children lifted their voices again, and the fragile stillness shattered into motion. Nia stood, slid her lunch bag into her backpack, and smiled at Ethan one more time. "See you tomorrow," she said, simple as that. She turned to leave, but before she made it 3 steps, a sharp voice called across the room. "Hold on a second." It was one of the parent volunteers, Mrs. Delaney, a polished woman in a cream cardigan with a silver cross at her neck and a clipboard pressed against her side. She had the kind of voice that never needed to be loud to make people stop. Several children did. Ms. Harper looked up from the stack of papers in her arms. Nia paused with one hand on her backpack strap. Mrs. Delaney stepped closer to the table, her eyes dropping to Ethan, then to the space beside his tray. "Where is the necklace?" she asked. Ethan's fingers curled at once, but the table in front of him was empty now except for the sandwich crusts and a milk carton tipped on its side. The little gold charm that had been there moments ago was gone. The air tightened so fast it almost made a sound. Nia blinked and looked back at the tabletop. For a second, she seemed not to understand the question. Then the color shifted in her face, not with guilt, but with that awful, cold awareness children get when they realize adults have begun telling a story about them before they have said a word. "It was right there," Mrs. Delaney said, more to the room than to Nia, but her gaze stayed fixed on the child. "I saw it myself." Ethan stared at the table, shoulders stiff again, all the softness from before closing up behind his eyes like a door swinging shut. Miss Harper crossed the room quickly. "Let us slow down," she said, calm but firm. "I am sure there is an explanation." Mrs. Delaney nodded, but not in agreement. It was the nod of someone who already believed she was being reasonable. "Of course there is," she said. "Children get curious. These things happen. We just need to find it." Around them, the lunchroom noise had faded into that strange half-silence that appears when everybody is pretending not to stare. Nia stood very still. Her backpack, faded purple with one broken zipper pull, hung from both shoulders now. Her braids rested against the front of her sweater. "I did not take anything," she said quietly. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. That made it hurt more somehow, the softness of it, the way she sounded like a child who already knew that truth was not always the loudest thing in a room. Ms. Harper crouched to her level. "I know, sweetheart. We are just going to look, that is all." But even gentle words can feel heavy when every eye in a room is waiting for what they will uncover. Mrs. Delaney held out a hand toward the backpack. "Would you mind opening it?" she asked. It was phrased like a choice. It did not feel like one. Nia swallowed and slowly slipped the bag off her shoulders. The cafeteria lights flashed across the worn fabric, across the frayed seams Clara Brooks had stitched twice by hand, once in blue thread and once again in black when the first patch did not hold. Nia pulled the zipper open. Inside there was no glittering charm, no hidden treasure, no evidence of anything except the plain, tender math of her life. A folded napkin, a library book with the plastic cover peeling at the edges, A pencil case with only 2 pencils inside, both sharpened down small. Her empty lunch container. And beneath it, wrapped in a dish towel with tiny faded lemons printed on the cloth, a narrow old recipe notebook with softened corners and a name written across the front in dark ink. Marcus Brooks. Mrs. Delaney's hand lowered. Miss Harper's expression changed, not because the mystery was solved, but because the contents of that little bag said more than anyone in the room had bothered to ask. Nia reached in and touched the notebook with 2 fingers, almost protectively. "My daddy wrote in that," she said, so softly the sentence nearly disappeared under the hum of the vending machine. On the other side of the table, Ethan lifted his head. His eyes moved from the empty space where the charm had been to the notebook in Nia's bag, then back to her face. Something flickered there, quick and frightened and important, as if he had remembered something just a second too late. Ethan stood so fast his chair legs scraped against the tile with a sharp, lonely sound that made half the room flinch. His breathing had changed. Not loud, not dramatic, but uneven enough for Ms. Harper to notice. He looked at Nia's open backpack, at the old recipe notebook wrapped in the lemon print towel, then down at his own lap as if the answer had been sitting there all along, waiting for him to be brave enough to find it. Mrs. Delaney opened her mouth to say something else, but he moved first. His right hand slipped into the pocket of his navy cardigan, small fingers stiff, uncertain, and when he pulled them back out, the gold charm was there, warm from being clenched too long in his palm. For one suspended second nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere near the juice cooler a carton dropped and rolled in a slow circle, but no one bent to pick it up. Ethan stared at the charm in his hand like it had betrayed him. Then he set it on the table with a soft click and whispered, "I had it." The words were barely above a breath, but the effect was immediate. Miss Harper went still. Mrs. Delaney blinked hard, color rising under her powder. A boy near the back muttered, "Oh," in the helpless way children do when they realize the grown-ups got something wrong. Nia did not move. Her hand was still resting on the edge of the recipe notebook inside her bag. The room had turned around so quickly that it had not yet caught up with her. Ethan's eyes lifted, not to the adults, but to Nia. His face had that fragile, distant look children get when they are trying to cross a bridge inside themselves and are afraid it might not hold. "I put it in my pocket," he said, a little clearer this time. I thought it would fall." His hand hovered above the charm, then pulled back. Miss Harper exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that sounded like she had been holding it for an hour. She rose from her crouch and looked first at Ethan, then at Nia, then at Mrs. Delaney. There was no anger in her face, only a quiet steadiness that somehow made the silence heavier. "Thank you for telling the truth," she said to Ethan. Then, more gently, she turned to Nia. "I am sorry. It was simple. No speech, no attempt to dress it up. Just 5 words. Nia nodded once, but her eyes stayed lowered a moment longer, fixed on the lemon print towel and the dark ink of her father's name. Marcus Brooks. She had heard apologies before. Some landed, some did not. This one reached her, but only partway. Mrs. Delaney adjusted the silver cross at her throat and cleared her voice. "Well," she said, trying to fold herself back into composure, "that settles it." But it did not settle anything, not really. Not the way the room had looked at Nia. Not the way suspicion had moved so quickly toward the smallest, poorest child standing there. Miss Harper knew that. Her jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Nia," she said, "would you come with me for a moment?" Nia hesitated, then zipped her backpack closed with careful hands. The metal teeth caught once before sliding shut. Ethan's gaze followed the movement. The little gold charm still sat between them on the table, bright and polished and suddenly small. As Nia lifted her bag, Ethan spoke again. At first it sounded like he might stop after the first word. Then he kept going. She did not take it. The sentence came out awkwardly, as if he had to lay each word down one by one and test whether it could hold his weight. Miss Harper turned. So did everyone else. Ethan swallowed. His fingers pressed flat against the table. "She shared with me before she knew my name." No one moved. Nia looked up then, truly looked at him, and the surprise in her face was not about being defended. It was about hearing the truth arrive from somewhere nobody expected. Miss Harper's eyes softened so quickly it was almost painful to watch. Mrs. Delaney looked away. The lunch monitor lowered her clipboard to her side. Even the children, who usually recovered from tension in seconds, stayed quiet. There was something sacred about the moment, though no one would have used that word out loud. A boy who had not spoken in full sentences for months had just spent one to protect a girl who had given him half her lunch. Nia's throat worked as if she wanted to say something back, but she only tightened her grip on the backpack strap. Across the room, the double doors near the front office swung open, letting in a blade of cooler hallway light and the crisp echo of dress shoes on linoleum. The principal stepped in first, one hand pressed politely to the small of a man's back as she guided him inside. He was tall, silver at the temples, his coat dark and immaculate, the kind of man whose presence changed the temperature of a room before he said a word. Two staff members trailed a respectful distance behind him, and just beyond the doorway, through the narrow glass pane, the outline of a black SUV waited at the curb. Gabriel Cole had arrived to pick up his son. He took in the cafeteria in a single glance, the half-cleared tables, the unnatural stillness, the teachers standing too straight, the gold charm on the table, and finally Ethan, still seated across from a little girl with a faded purple backpack and a lunch she had already given away. Then his eyes landed on the notebook in Nia's hand, just for an instant before she slipped it back into her bag, and something in his face changed so slightly that only someone watching very closely would have seen it. He stopped walking, because the name he thought he had glimpsed on that worn cover was a name he had not heard in more than 20 years, and yet it struck his chest with the force of hunger remembered. Gabriel Cole did not speak right away. Men like him were used to entering rooms and having the room answer first, with movement, with greetings, with the subtle rearranging of posture that money taught people without ever needing to raise its voice. But here, in the pale cafeteria light with the smell of cooling pizza and fruit cups hanging in the air, he stood completely still, his gaze fixed not on the teachers, or the principal, or even the little gold charm resting near his son's hand, but on the faded corner of the notebook slipping back into Nia's backpack. Marcus Brooks. The name moved through him, like something warm remembered on a cold day. It was so sudden, so old, that for a second he forgot where he was. The principal recovered first. "Mr. Cole," she said with careful brightness, "we were just finishing lunch." Gabriel nodded once without taking his eyes off the child across from Ethan. Nia looked very small beneath that attention, though not weak. Her sweater sleeves were slightly too long at the wrists. One sneaker lace had frayed near the plastic tip. She held her backpack to her chest with both arms, as if protecting something inside it that mattered more than the room. Gabriel had seen thousands of people look uncomfortable in his presence. Investors did it. Reporters did it. School boards and city officials and ambitious young executives did it all the time. But what he saw in Nia's face was not that. It was caution, the kind that came from being judged before being known. He turned slightly toward Ethan. His son was still seated, shoulders tense, one hand near the charm, eyes lowered now in the exhausted way children look after doing something brave. Gabriel's voice, when it came, was low and even. "What happened?" Ms. Harper stepped forward before anyone else could shape the story. She explained the missing charm, the misunderstanding, the backpack, and the truth Ethan had spoken. She did not embellish. She did not omit. That was one reason Gabriel trusted teachers more than most executives. They had less room for theater. As she spoke, his gaze moved once toward Mrs. Delaney, who seemed suddenly fascinated by the papers on her clipboard, and then back to Nia. And before all that, Ms. Harper added softly, "Nia shared her lunch with Ethan. He had not been eating much. Today he did." The sentence landed harder than she could have known. Gabriel looked at the half-sandwich crust still on the table, then at his son, then again at the little girl with the faded backpack. Something unguarded flickered across his face and was gone. "I see," he said, but he did not yet sound like he saw all of it. He stepped closer, enough that the polished leather of his shoes caught the cafeteria lights. Nia could smell a trace of clean cologne and winter air from his coat. Wealth had a scent sometimes. Not perfume exactly. More like dry wool, leather seats, and buildings with quiet heating systems. Gabriel lowered himself slightly, not all the way to her height, but enough to soften the distance. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nia Brooks," she said. Her voice was steady, though her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Gabriel let the name sit there. "Brooks. And the notebook," he said carefully. "That belonged to your father?" Nia nodded. "Yes, sir. Marcus Brooks. Another nod. This time her brow pulled together, because adults usually did not ask twice unless something underneath the question mattered. The room had gone quiet again, quieter even than before, because everyone could feel that the story had shifted onto a track no one else had seen until now. Gabriel's jaw tightened once. Not with anger. With memory. He glanced away from Nia and toward the tall cafeteria windows where the afternoon light lay flat and pale across the blacktop outside. When he spoke again, his voice had lost something polished in it. How old are you? 9. And your mother? She works mornings at St. Mary's Care Home and nights sometimes too. Nia answered plainly, without shame and without performance, as if she had long ago learned that the truth was easier to carry if you did not decorate it. Gabriel looked back at Ethan. His son had lifted his eyes now and was watching him with the quiet alertness of a child who recognized that something important was passing between the adults and did not yet understand the shape of it. Gabriel rested one hand lightly on the back of the empty chair beside him. "Ms. Harper," he said, still looking at Nia's backpack, "may I ask to see the notebook?" There was no command in it, only a strange gentleness that made everyone in the room more still than before. Nia hesitated. For one tiny second, Clara's voice seemed to rise in her memory from that cramped apartment kitchen where the radiator hissed and the windows rattled in winter. "Be respectful, baby, but not everybody gets to touch what your daddy left you." Nia swallowed. Then, slowly, she unzipped the bag again and pulled the notebook free from the lemon print towel. It was narrow and worn, the navy cover softened at the edges, a grease stain blooming faintly near the spine from some kitchen long gone. She held it out with both hands. Gabriel took it as if it were glass. The principal watched him. Miss Harper watched him. Even Mrs. Delaney looked up now. He opened the first page. The paper had yellowed. The handwriting slanted slightly right, dark and neat and unmistakable. At the top of the page, above a recipe for tomato soup stretched with cream and black pepper, was a line written in careful ink. "Feed the person in front of you first." Gabriel stopped breathing for half a beat. Because he had seen that sentence before, written by the same hand on the back of a paper bowl 30 years earlier, on a night when he and his mother had nothing in their apartment but cold water, 2 spoons, and the sound of the landlord pounding on the door. Gabriel closed the notebook slowly, but not before his thumb lingered over the line 1 second longer than anyone in the room could understand. The cafeteria had gone so still that the low mechanical hum of the soda machine near the wall sounded almost loud. Nia watched him with her head slightly tilted, not frightened now, only curious, because adults did not usually look at old things the way he was looking at that notebook. Miss Harper noticed it too. So did the principal. Even Mrs. Delaney, who had spent the last few minutes trying to disappear behind her clipboard, stood motionless beneath the hard white lights. Gabriel lifted his eyes at last, and when he looked at Nia again, the weight in his face had changed. The polished reserve was still there, the kind built from boardrooms and cameras and years of being the person everybody waited on, but behind it something else had broken through. Something older, softer, more human. "Where did your father get this notebook?" he asked. Nia shifted her backpack against her chest and answered the way children answer when they have been taught not to decorate the truth. "He wrote in it when he worked in kitchens. My mama says he always wrote things down because he did not trust memory when people were hungry." The sentence landed in Gabriel with the quiet force of a bell. He looked down again, at the cover, at the softened spine, at the dark ink of Marcus Brooks written in a steady hand. Then he asked, almost to himself, "Your father cooked?" Nia nodded. "Yes, sir. He said cooking was not just food. He said it was how you tell people they still matter." Miss Harper's eyes lowered then, briefly, because some truths felt too intimate to watch arrive on another person's face. Gabriel drew a slow breath and turned one more page. The paper whispered under his fingers. There were recipes written there in careful measurements, cups and teaspoons and oven temperatures, but between them were lines not meant for restaurants at all. "Stretch the soup before you stretch the truth. A full stomach hears kindness better. Never make a child ask twice." Gabriel swallowed. The principal, sensing something had shifted beyond school business, stepped back and gave the room a little more silence. Ethan sat without moving, watching his father now with an expression almost as fragile as the one he had worn earlier. He had seen men react to stock reports, headlines, and hospital updates. He had probably never seen his father stare at a notebook like it contained a doorway. Gabriel looked at his son, then at Nia, then back to the page. "When I was 10, he said quietly, and the entire room leaned into stillness without meaning to. My mother and I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on West Fulton. There were weeks when the heat barely worked. Some nights dinner was crackers in a mug because we did not have anything else." He stopped there, just long enough for the fluorescent buzz to fill in the space. No one interrupted. Wealth had made his story invisible over the years. People looked at men like Gabriel Cole and saw only the finished version. They did not picture drafty windows, overdue rent, and a boy learning how not to complain when the refrigerator hummed mostly empty. "There was a church kitchen 3 blocks away," he continued. "Not much to look at. Yellow tiles, bent steam trays, a back door that stuck in winter. My mother took me there one night because somebody told her they served meals with no questions asked." He let out the smallest breath through his nose. Not a laugh. Not quite sorrow either. "The man behind the counter handed me a paper bowl of tomato soup and half a grilled cheese. He wrote something on the side of the bowl with a marker before he gave it to me." Nia's eyes widened. Gabriel lowered the notebook slightly, enough for the line on the first page to catch the light again. It was this: "Feed the person in front of you first." The words seemed to float there between them. Miss Harper lifted one hand to her mouth. The principal blinked twice, as if the emotion had caught her off guard. Mrs. Delaney's shoulders dropped by an inch. Ethan looked from the notebook to his father with the stunned stillness of a child watching memory become real. Nia did not speak. She only tightened her fingers around the strap of her backpack, because something in the air had grown bigger than the room. Gabriel closed the notebook again and held it gently. Both hands now, no longer like an object, but like a piece of someone. "Marcus Brooks served us that night," he said. "And then the next week. And the week after that. He always gave my mother an extra roll wrapped in a napkin and acted like he had made too many. He knew pride when he saw it. He knew hunger too." His voice did not break, but it came close enough for everyone to hear the edge of it. Nia stared at him, her lips parting slightly. "You knew my daddy?" she asked. Gabriel looked at her with a tenderness so immediate it changed his whole face. "I did not know him the way you did," he said. "But I knew what he did for people, and I have not forgotten." Across the cafeteria, someone outside rolled a trash cart down the hallway, its wheels rattling faintly over the floor seams. The ordinary sound made the moment feel even stranger, as if the world had continued moving while something sacred paused inside it. Ethan's hand moved slowly across the table until his fingertips rested near the gold charm again. But this time he did not clutch it. He only touched it lightly, listening. Gabriel turned toward Nia and held the notebook out to her with both hands, returning it the way people return something precious from a church pew or a hospital room. She took it carefully. "Your father fed more than people," he said. "He fed dignity. That is harder to find." Nia looked down at the cover, then back at him, and for the first time since the accusation, the tightness around her eyes loosened. She was still only 9 years old, still standing in a cafeteria with a faded backpack and an empty lunch container, but the room no longer saw only that. It saw inheritance. It saw a line of kindness stretching farther back than anyone had guessed. And in the far corner by the windows, where the pale afternoon light had started to thin, Ethan drew in a careful breath and opened his mouth as if he had been holding one sentence inside him for a very long time. Ethan's voice came out thin at first, like it had to travel a longer distance than anyone else's. "She was nice to me." For words. Small words. But they landed in the cafeteria with more force than a speech. Gabriel turned toward his son fully now, and the look in his eyes changed again, this time not with memory, but with something even rarer for him lately. Relief. It moved through him quietly, almost cautiously, as if he did not trust himself to reach for it too fast. Ethan sat with both hands flat on the table, his fingers spread beside the little gold charm, his face pale under the white lights, but his eyes were clearer than they had been when Gabriel walked in. Nia did not move. She stood holding the notebook against her sweater, feeling the shape of it through the fabric, the worn edge pressing lightly into her forearm. She had not expected any of this when she unwrapped her lunch an hour earlier. Not the accusation, not the apology, not the billionaire standing in front of her speaking her father's name like it still carried warmth. And certainly not the boy across from her, choosing words in front of a room full of adults. Miss Harper looked between them, one hand resting over the worksheets she had never finished passing out. She knew enough about grief to recognize a miracle when it refused to announce itself like one. Most miracles in schools were small. A child raising a hand after weeks of silence. A mother answering the phone after months of missed calls. A father making it to pick up on time for once. They did not come with music. They came with fluorescent lights and half-eaten lunches, and children too young to understand they had just changed the temperature of a room. Ethan swallowed and looked at Nia. "You shared first," he said, slower now, but steadier. Before anything." Nia blinked, then gave the smallest nod, the kind that meant she understood more than she could explain. Gabriel pulled out the empty chair beside Ethan and sat down, not with the easy confidence of a man claiming space, but with the deliberate care of someone who knew the moment belonged to children. His coat opened slightly as he leaned forward, and Nia caught a glimpse of a plain white dress shirt. No tie now, the top button undone, as if the day had already worn him down before he walked into the school. Up close, he looked less like the man on magazine covers, and more like somebody's tired father trying not to mishandle a fragile thing. He rested his forearms lightly on the table. "Ethan," he said gently, "can you tell me what happened?" The boy's eyes dropped to the gold charm. He picked it up, turned it once between his fingers, then set it back down. "I thought I lost it," he said. "Then I put it in my pocket. I forgot." His voice dipped on the last word, shame curling around it. Gabriel nodded slowly. He did not rush to fill the silence after. Nia noticed that. Adults usually hurried when children were uncomfortable. They softened. They explained. They saved. Gabriel did none of that. He simply waited, giving his son room to hold the truth without rescuing him from it. It was a kind of respect Nia recognized, even at 9. And when they asked where it was, Gabriel said. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "I got scared." He did not say of what. He did not need to. The room understood. Scared of being wrong. Scared of being looked at. Scared of all those grown-up eyes pressing in at once. Gabriel's gaze flicked toward Mrs. Delaney, then away again, smooth as a blade sliding back into its sheath. He would deal with that later. For now, his son came first. "Thank you for telling the truth," he said. Ethan nodded once, as though the effort of speaking had left him tired down to the bone. Then Gabriel did something no one expected. He turned to Nia. "And thank you," he said. No performance. No polished public voice. Just gratitude, direct and level. Nia shifted her weight. "For what, sir?" she asked. A faint smile touched one side of his mouth, the kind born from sorrow before happiness. "For feeding my son before anyone asked you to." The answer settled over the table like warm cloth. Nia looked down at the notebook in her arms. "He looked hungry," she said. "Not regular hungry. Quiet hungry." Miss Harper closed her eyes briefly. Even Mrs. Delaney lowered her clipboard at last. Gabriel stared at Nia as if she had just spoken a language he had once known and nearly forgotten. Quiet hungry. That was exactly it. Not the hunger for food alone, though there had been that too. The deeper kind. The kind that grief left behind when it took the shape of appetite and speech and joy and folded them inward until a child seemed to disappear while sitting right in front of you. Ethan's mother had been gone 14 months. In all that time, Gabriel had hired specialists, tutors, therapists, consultants with calm voices and expensive shoes. He had moved meetings, bought time, rearranged his empire in careful squares, and still his son had drifted through most days like a boy listening from underwater. Yet here, in a public school cafeteria with scratched tables and milk stains drying in rings, a 9-year-old girl with a paper lunch bag had reached him by simply noticing he was alone. Gabriel leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the room. The principal understood at once. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "perhaps we should move this conversation to my office." He almost agreed. It would have been the reasonable thing. Cleaner, more private, more adult. But Ethan was still looking at Nia, and Nia was still standing there with that backpack strap pressing a red mark into her shoulder. If they moved the moment, it might collapse. Some truths only stayed alive where they were born. Gabriel shook his head lightly. "Just another minute," he said. Then he looked at Nia again. "Your father," he began, choosing each word with care. "Did he ever tell you about a church kitchen on West Fulton?" Nia frowned in thought. The cafeteria waited. "No, sir," she said after a second. "But he used to say there was one place where people came in cold and left feeling seen." Gabriel lowered his eyes. A breath left him that sounded almost like a prayer. Because that was the place. That was Marcus. Even now, after all the money and years and polished glass buildings, he could still smell the tomato soup from that kitchen if he let himself remember hard enough. He could still see steam fogging the serving line, hear plastic trays knocking together, feel his mother's hand at the back of his coat guiding him forward when she was too proud to ask, but too tired not to. And standing behind the counter had been Marcus Brooks, apron dusted with flour, smile tired but real, feeding strangers like it was an ordinary thing to keep them human. Gabriel lifted his gaze again, and in it now was decision, quiet and heavy and already in motion. "I think," he said, looking from Nia to the notebook and then to his son, "your father and I have a debt to settle, even if he is not here to collect it." And at that exact moment, out in the hallway beyond the cafeteria doors, the front office secretary appeared breathless beside the principal's assistant, holding a phone to her chest, and saying there was a woman downstairs asking if her daughter, Nia Brooks, was in some kind of trouble. Clara Brooks reached the cafeteria doors with the breathless urgency of a woman who had left work before anyone could tell her not to. Her scrub top, pale green beneath a thrift store coat, still carried the faint clean scent of disinfectant and hand lotion from St. Mary's Care Home. A loose curl had slipped free near her temple, and her eyes moved through the room the way mother's eyes do when fear gets there before facts. She saw the principal first, then the teachers, then the cluster of adults standing too still, and finally Nia, small and upright beside the lunch table with her backpack held tight against her chest. Clara crossed the floor in quick steps. "Baby," she said, dropping to one knee in front of her daughter, both hands going straight to Nia's shoulders as if to confirm she was whole. "Are you all right?" Nia nodded at once. "Yes, Mama." The answer came quickly, but Clara still searched her face another second, looking for what children sometimes hid in the corners of their mouths and eyes. Only when she found no tears did her posture loosen by a fraction. Then she stood, one hand still resting lightly on Nia's back, and turned toward the adults. There was dignity in the motion, though her coat sleeve was frayed at the cuff, and she had clearly come in a hurry. "I was told there was a problem," she said. Her voice was polite. It was also careful, the kind of careful that had learned what rooms could do to women like her if they entered them already sounding defensive. The principal stepped forward, ready to explain, but Gabriel spoke first. "Ms. Brooks," he said, and the room shifted at once because everyone heard the difference in how he addressed her. Not like a stranger to be managed, like a person whose name mattered. Clara looked at him then, really looked, and recognition flickered across her face only in the most general sense. She knew who he was, of course. Most people in the city did. But she did not know why a man like Gabriel Cole was standing in a school cafeteria beside her daughter. Her hand tightened briefly on Nia's shoulder. "Yes," she said. Gabriel glanced at the notebook peeking from the top of Nia's backpack, then back at Clara. "There was a misunderstanding," he said. "Your daughter was treated unfairly, and I want to be very clear that she did nothing wrong." Mrs. Delaney lowered her eyes. The principal gave the smallest nod, relieved that someone had finally named it plain. Clara did not relax yet. Women who worked double shifts did not trust relief on first offer. "What kind of misunderstanding?" she asked. Ms. Harper explained gently, with all the details but none of the cruelty, and Clara listened without interrupting, though her expression changed when she heard about the backpack, the missing charm, and the suspicion that had fallen first and fastest on Nia. Not anger exactly. Something more contained. Older. The look of a woman who had seen that pattern before and hated that her child had met it this young. Nia leaned into her mother just slightly, not out of fear now, but out of habit, and Clara smoothed a hand over one blue ribbon at the end of her braid. When Ms. Harper finished, Ethan surprised them all again. He looked up at Clara and said, slow but clear, "She helped me." Clara stared at him for a second, her face softening in spite of everything. "Thank you for saying that," she told him. Gabriel watched the exchange in silence, his eyes moving from Ethan to Clara to Nia, measuring not money or influence or opportunity, but lineage, resemblance, the shape of kindness repeated. Then he said the words that made Clara go still. "I knew Marcus." The cafeteria did not move. Clara's gaze snapped fully to his. You knew my husband? The question came out low, cautious, almost disbelieving. Gabriel nodded once. Not the way you did. But when I was a boy, he fed my mother and me at a church kitchen on West Fulton. He wrote in that notebook. Clara looked down at the bag on Nia's shoulder, as if she could see straight through the canvas to the pages inside. When she lifted her eyes again, they were bright with something she was trying hard to keep from spilling over. Marcus worked there before Nia was born, she said softly. He used to come home smelling like onions and rosemary, and say it was the best work he ever did, because hungry people never lied with their faces. Gabriel's mouth tightened with recognition. That sounds like him. Clara let out the faintest breath, a sound halfway between a laugh and grief. He believed if you had one sandwich, you broke it. He used to tell Nia that all the time. Nia looked up at her mother, then at Gabriel, because the sentence had traveled from her home to a stranger's memory without losing a word. Gabriel glanced at Ethan, who was listening with unusual stillness, and then back to Clara. Your daughter did exactly that today, he said. And my son spoke more in the last 15 minutes than he has in weeks. Clara's eyes moved to Ethan then, really seeing him now, the careful posture, the guarded face, the little gold charm near his hand. Some understanding passed across her features, quiet and immediate. She had worked around the elderly long enough to recognize loneliness in any age. Sometimes children know where hurt is before adults do, she said. Gabriel gave the smallest nod, as if the sentence had struck something true he had been too exhausted to name for himself. The late afternoon light had shifted now, turning thinner through the cafeteria windows, laying pale gold across the scratched tables and lunch trays. Outside, the black SUV still waited at the curb, patient and polished, but inside the room, nothing felt polished anymore. It felt stripped down to essentials. Hunger, memory, children. Clara looked at Nia, then at the adults who had gathered around her. Daughter's ordinary act as if it had opened a door nobody else could find. We should probably get home, she said quietly, though the sentence sounded less like a decision than a way to steady herself. Gabriel rose from the chair beside Ethan. Before you do, he said, reaching inside his coat pocket. There is something I need to ask, and it is not small. Clara's posture changed at once, wary but composed. Gabriel pulled out a business card, though he did not offer it yet. He looked first at Nia, then at the notebook in her bag, and finally at Clara. Would you allow me to visit you this evening, he asked, so I can tell you what your husband's kindness built in the life of a boy neither of you ever saw again? Clara did not answer right away. She stood in the thinning cafeteria light with one hand resting on Nia's shoulder and the other curled loosely around the strap of her own worn tote bag, the kind with receipts and hand lotion and an extra pair of socks for a child stuffed somewhere near the bottom. Her face was calm, but Gabriel could see the thinking behind it, the quick, careful measuring of risk that mothers learned when life had asked them too many times to decide fast without enough information. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sky had turned the color of dull silver, and the playground beyond the fence sat empty except for one forgotten red ball near the swings. Inside, the room still felt held in place by something no one wanted to break too quickly. Nia leaned lightly against her mother now, not because she was afraid, but because children always knew when the adults had stepped into a moment larger than school and lunch and missing jewelry. Clara looked at Gabriel for a long second, then at Ethan, then back to Nia's backpack where the notebook rested safely inside. This evening, she repeated. Her voice carried no rudeness, only caution and a trace of disbelief that a man whose name was on buildings was asking to come to her apartment like an ordinary guest with a story to tell. Gabriel nodded. Yes. He did not offer more at first. He seemed to understand that if he rushed the request, it would sound like power. And power, Clara had learned, often arrived smiling. Ethan shifted in his chair and looked up at his father, then at Nia, then down again. The little gold charm sat beside his hand, catching the overhead light in one small steady glint. Miss Harper, sensing the delicacy of the moment, stepped back farther with the principal, giving the conversation room to breathe. Even Mrs. Delaney kept silent now, her clipboard lowered against her side, like something she no longer deserved to hold between herself and the truth. Clara drew in a slow breath. I do not mean disrespect, she said, and Gabriel heard at once that this was the sentence of someone used to entering other people's spaces carefully. But I do not let people into my home just because they ask nicely. Nia tipped her face up toward her mother, listening. Gabriel surprised her by giving the faintest nod, as if the answer itself had earned his respect. You should not, he said. Especially not today. That changed something. Only slightly, but Clara felt it. There was no offense in him, no impatience. Just a tired honesty that did not match the image she had carried of men like him. She studied his face again. Up close, he looked less untouchable than the city made him seem. The corners of his eyes were worn. His coat was expensive, yes, but the man inside it looked like he had not slept a full night in a long time. Then why tonight? Clara asked. Gabriel glanced toward Ethan, and when he answered, some of the iron in his voice had gone quiet. Because I know what it is to wait too long to repay a kindness and wake up one day realizing the person who gave it is gone. The words settled into the room with the weight of something lived, not rehearsed. Clara's expression softened despite herself. Nia, sensing the shift more than understanding it, reached up and took her mother's hand. Gabriel continued, not pressing, simply laying out the truth the way Marcus once must have laid out bread on a counter. Your husband helped my mother when she could not afford groceries. He fed us without making us feel small. He gave me back some piece of dignity before I was old enough to know the word for it. Today your daughter did something for my son that no money has managed to do. In over a year. I am asking for an hour, not because I am important, but because Marcus Brooks was. The fluorescent hum overhead seemed to fade beneath the quiet that followed. Clara blinked once, then looked away toward the windows, where the pale light had dropped low enough to catch the dust in the air. Marcus Brooks was. Grief had a way of arriving sharp even years later when somebody said a loved one's name with reverence instead of sympathy. She swallowed and looked back at Gabriel. Nia has homework, she said softly. It was not a refusal. It was a mother reaching for the ordinary because the extraordinary had become too close too fast. To her surprise, Gabriel's mouth curved in the smallest smile. Then I will not stay long. Ethan looked at his father then, something tentative stirring behind his eyes. Can Nia come tomorrow? He asked, and the question, simple as it was, made Ms. Harper press her lips together to hide the emotion rising there. Gabriel looked at him. To school. Ethan nodded. Yes. Nia answered before any adult could. I always come tomorrow if it is a school day. Ethan's fingers loosened around the edge of the table. It was not quite a smile that touched his face, but it was the beginning of one. Clara looked down at her daughter, then back at Gabriel, and some private calculation ended inside her. You can come by, she said at last. But it is just a small apartment. Gabriel shook his head once. That is not a problem. Clara gave him the address slowly, making him repeat it back, and he did without complaint. When he got it right, she nodded. Nia tightened her arms around the backpack. Ethan looked at her as if trying to memorize something he had only just found. Gabriel rose, and before the moment could scatter into its separate lives again, he said one more thing, not to Clara this time, but to Nia. Keep that notebook close. Nia looked down at the bag and then up at him. I do, she said. Gabriel held her gaze for a second, and in it was gratitude, grief, and a promise not yet spoken aloud. Then the principal finally moved, the cafeteria breathed again, and the ordinary noises of the building slowly returned, but none of them sounded quite the same anymore. Because by nightfall a billionaire would be standing in a two-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, about to tell a widow and her little girl that one bowl of soup had once changed the direction of his entire life. That evening the city felt colder than it had at noon, though the forecast on the convenience store window still insisted it was 48 degrees. Clara Brooks climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor with Nia's hand tucked in hers, and her tote bag bumping softly against her hip, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by old wood and thin carpet. The apartment hallway smelled faintly of radiator heat, laundry detergent, and somebody downstairs frying onions for dinner. Nia carried her backpack on both shoulders even though they were already home, because the notebook inside it had become heavier in her mind after the school cafeteria, not heavier in pounds, but in meaning. Clara unlocked the door with the same careful twist she always used because the deadbolt stuck in damp weather. Inside, the apartment was warm in that uneven way old buildings were warm. One room almost cozy, the next touched by a draft sneaking through the window frame. The kitchen light cast a buttery circle over the counter where a dish rack held 3 plates, 2 chipped mugs, and the blue lunch container Nia had washed the night before. On the small table by the wall sat a glass jar full of pencils. A stack of overdue mail Clara had turned upside down so the red stamps would not be the first thing her daughter saw, and a thrift store vase holding 2 fake daisies that had faded almost white in the sun. Nia dropped her backpack carefully onto the chair nearest the radiator. Clara slipped off her coat, hung it on the back of the door, and stood still for one brief second, staring at the room as if seeing it through someone else's eyes. Not because she was ashamed. She had outgrown shame for honest things a long time ago. But there was a difference between living inside a place and imagining what it looked like to someone who arrived from polished elevators and private drivers. Nia watched her mother's face and knew better than to ask what she was thinking. Children who grew up with less learned to read quiet the way other children read picture books. Clara turned toward the stove and reached for the pot she used most nights, the one with the loose handle Marcus had promised to fix before there was no more time to promise things. Homework first, she said gently, reclaiming the ordinary in the only way she knew how. Nia nodded and pulled her workbook from the bag, but instead of opening it right away, she drew out the notebook wrapped in the lemon print towel and laid it on the table with both hands. The navy cover looked softer under the kitchen light, almost velvety where years had worn the grain smooth. Marcus Brooks. Nia traced the letters with one finger. Mama, she asked quietly, did Daddy really know Mr. Cole? Clara filled the kettle at the sink and listened to the old pipes answer with a shiver. Looks like your daddy knew a lot more people than I thought, she said. The answer was light, but her voice was not. She set the kettle down and leaned one hip against the counter, watching her daughter watch that notebook. Your father never talked much about who he helped, she added after a moment. He said if you keep count, it stops being kindness and turns into bookkeeping. Nia smiled faintly, because that sounded exactly like Marcus, at least in the pieces of him she carried from photographs, stories, and the echo of his sayings stitched through their life. Clara had been pregnant with Nia when Marcus got sick. Nia had no memory of his voice except the one her mother rebuilt for her over the years in kitchen stories, bedtime lines, and recipe cards read aloud like scripture. The kettle had just begun its low pre-whistle murmur when headlights slid across the living room wall through the blinds and stopped. Clara's shoulders went still. Outside, an engine softened to silence. Nia turned toward the window. Through the narrow gap in the blinds, the black SUV looked almost unreal against the faded brick and patchy sidewalk, too glossy for a place where bicycles rusted against railings, and somebody's broken folding chair had sat beside the dumpster since August. Clara smoothed both palms down the front of her sweater without realizing she was doing it. Stay by me, she said, though Nia already had. A soft knock came 3 breaths later. Not loud, not entitled, just measured like. The person on the other side knew he was arriving in someone else's life, not summoning them into his. Clara opened the door only after checking the peephole twice. Gabriel Cole stood in the hall without his overcoat now, just a dark wool jacket over a white shirt with the sleeves showing at the wrist. No assistant. No bodyguard at his elbow. Just him, carrying a plain bakery box in one hand and an expression that looked less certain than anyone at school would have expected. Behind him, farther down the stairs, the driver waited out of sight except for one polished shoe visible on the landing below. Gabriel lifted the box slightly. I was not sure what was polite, he said, and the sentence, awkward in its honesty, did more to lower Clara's guard than any polished apology could have. She looked at the box, then at him. What is it? She asked. Cornbread from a place on Madison, he said. The owner said it was the closest thing to church kitchen cornbread in this part of the city. For one brief second Clara nearly smiled. Nearly. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. Gabriel crossed the threshold slowly, his eyes adjusting to the warm yellow light, the smallness of the room, the soft ticking wall clock above the fridge, the framed school picture of Nia beside a photo of Marcus in an apron, smiling beside a stock pot larger than his torso. The sight of that photo stopped him. Not dramatically, just enough for Clara to notice. He looked older in that second, not from age, but from memory catching up all at once. Nia stood near the kitchen table with the notebook in front of her, and her workbook still closed. Gabriel's gaze moved from Marcus's photo to the child, and then to the notebook. The apartment held its breath around them. The radiator hissed. The kettle clicked off on the stove. Somewhere in the building a baby cried, and then quieted. Gabriel set the bakery box down on the table beside the notebook and looked at Clara first. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. Then he looked at Nia. "And thank you for keeping that safe." Nia rested her hand on the cover protectively. "I always do," she said. Gabriel nodded once, as if that answer mattered more than she knew. He took in the little kitchen, the chipped mugs, the dish towel hanging by the sink, the homework sheet waiting untouched, and something softened again behind his eyes. This was not nostalgia. It was recognition. Clara noticed that too. She pulled out the kitchen chair nearest the table. "You can sit there," she said. It was not hospitality in the fancy sense. It was something more honest than that. A place offered. Gabriel sat. The chair creaked under a weight it was not used to holding, not because he was large, but because the room itself had never expected a man like him inside it. Clara remained standing a moment longer, then sat opposite him with Nia beside her. The notebook lay between them like a fourth voice waiting to speak. Gabriel folded his hands once, unfolded them, then glanced toward Marcus's photograph on the wall. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the distance it carried at school. "The first time your husband fed me," he said quietly. "I was so hungry I ate the soup too fast and burned the roof of my mouth. But I still remember what he said before he handed me the bowl. He looked me straight in the eye and said, 'Take your time, young man. The world has already rushed you enough.'" Clara did not move for several seconds after he said it. The kettle had gone silent on the stove, but the apartment still held a warmth that came from old pipes and held on routines, the kind of warmth that never spread evenly yet somehow made hardship feel less sharp at the edges. Nia sat with both hands around the notebook now, her homework forgotten, her eyes moving from Gabriel to the photograph of Marcus on the wall and back again, as if she were trying to line up the father she knew through stories with the man sitting in her kitchen remembering him in real time. Clara looked at the picture too. Marcus in his apron, smiling beside that giant stockpot, one hand curled around a ladle, like feeding people was the most ordinary sacred thing in the world. When she finally spoke, her voice came out softer than before. "That sounds like him." Gabriel nodded. "He always spoke to me like I was more than a poor kid showing up for free dinner. He never used pity. Not once." He glanced at Nia, then back to Clara. "Children know the difference. So do adults, even if they pretend they do not." Clara lowered herself into the chair more fully, one hand resting beside the bakery box he had brought. Her fingers touched the cardboard lid lightly, then pulled away. "Marcus hated pity," she said. Said it sat wrong in the stomach. A quiet smile moved across Gabriel's face, brief and tired and unmistakably real. "That sounds like him too." Nia looked down at the notebook and carefully opened it to the first page, the paper whispering beneath her fingers. "Feed the person in front of you first." She had seen the line before, of course. She had traced it on nights when the apartment felt too quiet and her mother was still at work, and the only sounds were the refrigerator hum and the bus outside braking at the corner. But hearing another person say her father had once written those same words on a paper bowl for a hungry boy made them feel less like family wisdom and more like something that had walked through the world and returned. "Did Daddy know you would be rich?" Nia asked. The question was so direct and so purely childlike that Clara almost apologized for it on instinct, but Gabriel answered before she could. "No," he said, and there was not a trace of offense in him. "I did not know either." Nia considered that. Then why did he help? Gabriel looked at the notebook, then at the kitchen counter, at the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, at the little signs of a home built from effort instead of ease. "Because your father was the kind of man who did not need to know the ending before he did the right thing." The sentence settled into the apartment and seemed to stay there, joining the radiator hiss and the clock ticking over the fridge. Clara looked down at her hands. They were work-roughened hands, knuckles dry from sanitizer and winter air, nails kept short because caring for other people did not leave room for decoration. Marcus had loved those hands. Used to say they looked like somebody honest lived in them. Gabriel drew a slow breath. "I should tell you the rest," he said. "There is more than one meal in this story." Clara raised her eyes. Again, Nia went still. Gabriel leaned back slightly in the chair, though the apartment was too small for any gesture to feel distant. After that first night, My mother took me back the next week. She almost did not. She was proud, and pride can starve a person as quietly as anything else. But rent was late, the heat had gone out twice, and she had not eaten enough herself to keep pretending. Marcus saw it before either of us said a word. He gave me soup again, but this time he handed her a container too. Said the kitchen had extra. I knew even then it was not extra. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. She could picture that so easily it hurt. Marcus coming home late with his sleeves smelling like garlic and steam, telling her there had been extra bread, extra stew, extra cornbread, when what he really meant was somebody needed to leave with more than they arrived with, and he had decided that mattered more than inventory. Gabriel continued, his voice steady, low, shaped more by memory than performance. A month later my mother got sick. Nothing dramatic. Just run down, tired, more tired than she would admit. Marcus noticed she stopped coming to the line and started sending me in alone. So one night he walked out from behind the counter, put 2 foil pans in a grocery sack, and asked where we lived. Clara stared at him now. He brought food to your apartment? Gabriel nodded. 3 flights up. Building smelled like bleach and damp carpet. He carried chicken and rice, green beans cooked too soft, and a peach cobbler that fogged the whole room when he opened the lid. He set it on our table like he had been invited for Sunday supper, instead of rescuing strangers from a week they might not have made it through with dignity intact. Nia's mouth parted slightly. She loved peach cobbler. Her mother only made it on birthdays or when canned peaches were marked down enough to feel like mercy. Did he stay? She asked. Gabriel's eyes drifted to Marcus's photograph again. Long enough to fix a cabinet door that had fallen crooked. Long enough to make my mother laugh one time. Long enough to tell me never to confuse being poor with being small. Clara pressed her lips together, and for the first time since he arrived, she let the emotion show plainly. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It gathered in her eyes and made them shine under the kitchen light. He used to say that here too, she whispered. Nia reached for her mother's hand under the table and found it easily. Gabriel noticed, and something in his expression softened further. He looked around the apartment once more, not inspecting it, not measuring it against his own life, just seeing it. The chipped mug by the sink, the carefully stacked mail, the fake daisies in the thrift store vase, the patched curtain hem, the life of people who kept going even when ease did not choose them. I built companies later, he said quietly. People like to call that vision. They make speeches about grit and instincts and timing. But the truth is simpler than that. When I was young, a man I barely knew treated hunger like it was urgent and dignity like it was part of the meal. It changed the way I understood value. It changed how I saw people. It changed everything. Clara looked at him, and some final layer of caution eased, not because money had entered her home, but because memory had. Real memory. Earned memory. She nodded once, almost to herself. Marcus would not have wanted praise, she said. No, Gabriel answered. But I think he would have wanted the kindness to keep moving. Nia looked down at the notebook, then up again. Is that why you came? She asked. Gabriel held her gaze, and when he answered, there was weight in it now, the kind that comes just before a door opens onto something bigger than the room you are in. Yes, he said. I came because what your father gave me did not end with me. And what you did for Ethan today proved his kindness is still traveling. So I did not come only to thank you. I came because I want to place something back into your family's hands that should have returned a long time ago. The apartment seemed to draw inward after he said it, as if even the walls wanted to hear what came next. The clock above the refrigerator kept ticking in its small, stubborn rhythm. The radiator breathed heat into one corner and not the other, and somewhere down the hallway. Television laughed too loudly at something nobody in this room could hear. But inside Clara Brooks's kitchen, everything had narrowed to the table, the notebook, and the man sitting across from them with memory in his eyes and unfinished gratitude in his hands. Clara did not reach for the bakery box, or the stack of mail, or the mug by the sink. She sat very still, one hand curled around Nia's, and waited. Nia did too, though children waited differently. Her gaze moved from Gabriel's face to the notebook and back again, alert and solemn, as if she understood that grown-up truths were often heavy before they were kind. Gabriel drew a slow breath and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. For a moment Clara stiffened, not from fear exactly, but from the old instinct that came when life had taught her that surprises rarely arrived carrying peace. What he pulled out was not a contract, Not a sleek leather folder, not anything polished enough to make the room shrink. It was an envelope. Thick, cream-colored, its edges softened slightly as though it had been handled more than once before tonight. He set it on the table with care, not pushing it toward them yet, only letting it exist there between the cornbread box and Marcus's notebook. "A year after I left for college," he said quietly, "my mother died." The sentence came plain, with no ornament, and that plainness made it land harder. Nia's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Clara lowered her eyes for a second in the way people do when grief, even borrowed grief, deserves a bowed head. Gabriel kept going, his voice low and even. "I was 19, too young to know how to lose the only person who remembers your first hunger, too proud to ask for help, too busy becoming the kind of man people would one day call successful." His mouth shifted slightly on the last word, as if success had become a language too many others spoke on his behalf. "After her funeral, I found this in a shoebox with utility bills, church bulletins, and every report card I ever brought home." He touched the envelope with 2 fingers. She had written Marcus's name on the front, told me in a note inside that if life ever became generous to me, I was to return something to the family of the man who fed us when there was no reason to believe we would ever be able to repay him. Clara's breath caught so softly, it was almost just a change in the room. Gabriel slid the envelope forward then, not all the way, just enough for the kitchen light to catch the careful handwriting on the front. "For the family of Marcus Brooks." Clara stared at it, as if looking too quickly might make it disappear. Nia looked too, her lips parting. "My mother saved every extra dollar she could after things got better," Gabriel said. "Not much at first, then more. I added to it over the years, but I never found you." The church kitchen closed. Records were incomplete. Tom did what Tom does. "Then today your daughter opened her lunch bag and reminded my son how kindness enters a room." Clara's eyes lifted to his again, bright now, no longer trying to hide it. "What is in it?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already knew it was not just paper. Gabriel answered with the same quiet honesty he had brought through her front door. "A cashier's check in Marcus Brooks's name, reissued to his estate and prepared for transfer. Enough to pay off every debt I could reasonably guess a hardworking family might be carrying. Enough to fund Nia's education through college if that is what she wants one day. Enough to make sure the next time hunger comes near this apartment, it does not stay." Silence followed, but not the painful kind. This was the stunned, reverent kind, the kind that arrives when a long-delayed answer finally finds the right address. Clara did not touch the envelope. Instead, she looked at Marcus's photograph on the wall, and the tears she had been holding back all evening finally rose, not falling yet, only gathering until her eyes shone under the kitchen light. "Marcus would have said no at first," she whispered. Gabriel nodded. "I know." A faint, sad smile touched Clara's mouth. "Then he would have made coffee and told you to sit down, because no blessing should be handled standing up." Nia looked between them and asked the question only a child would ask in that moment. "Does this mean Daddy's kindness came home?" Gabriel turned to her, and whatever reserve remained in him gave way completely. "Yes," he said. "I think that is exactly what it means." Then Clara finally reached for the envelope, but before she opened it, she laid her other hand on the notebook beside it, anchoring the old gift and the returned one together. And in that small kitchen with the radiator hissing and the cornbread cooling in its box, the kindness Marcus Brooks had once carried out into the world found its way back to his table at last. Clara opened the envelope with both hands, slowly, as if anything rushed might spill the meaning out too fast. The paper inside was heavier than ordinary paper, the kind that felt official even before you read it. The kitchen light pooled over the check, over the signature, over the number that made her inhale so sharply she had to set it down on the table for a second just to keep her fingers steady. Nia leaned closer, not because she understood the amount in full, but because she understood her mother's face. Children always knew when a number had become more than math. Gabriel did not speak. He let the room have the silence. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere on the street. Down the hall, the neighbor's television rose and fell behind a wall too thin to hold life completely apart. But in Clara's apartment, everything had narrowed to that check, the notebook, and the photograph of Marcus smiling above the stove like he had somehow known this night would come. Clara looked up at Gabriel, eyes bright now, not only with grief, but with the strain of being seen so suddenly after so many years of holding the line alone. "This is too much," she whispered. It was the first thing anyone with real dignity says when grace arrives carrying weight. Gabriel shook his head once. "No," he said gently. "It is late. That is not the same thing." Clara lowered her eyes again. Late. The word found every unpaid bill, every double shift, every moment she had stretched soup with water and called it enough, every winter coat bought one size too big so it could survive another year. Nia rested one small hand over the edge of the envelope, as if helping to hold it in place. "Mama," she asked softly. Clara covered her daughter's hand with her own. "It means we can breathe a little easier, baby." Nia looked at the check, then at the notebook, then at Gabriel. "Because Daddy fed people?" she asked. Gabriel's expression softened into something almost like wonder. "Because he did it without asking who could pay him back." Clara sat back slowly in her chair. The old wood creaked beneath her. She wiped once beneath one eye with the side of her thumb, not hiding the tears anymore, because there was no shame in this room now, only return. "Marcus used to say kindness was never lost," she murmured. "Just delayed on the road sometimes." Gabriel let out a quiet breath that could have been a laugh if grief had not shaped it first. "Then I guess I've been stuck in traffic for 20 years. That made Clara smile through the wetness in her eyes, and the sight of it changed the room again. It made it warmer, lighter, human in a simpler way. Nia looked between them, pleased by a joke she only halfway understood, and then her gaze drifted to the bakery box. "Can we eat the cornbread now?" she asked. The question was so perfectly timed, so childlike and necessary, that all three of them paused before the truth of it settled in. Life did not wait for grand emotion to finish before asking for dinner. Clara laughed then, softly but fully, one hand rising to cover her mouth. Gabriel smiled for real this time, the kind of smile that made him look years younger and far less famous. "I was hoping someone would ask," he said. Clara stood, reached for a plate from the dish rack, then another and another, because Marcus would have been offended by cornbread served from a box without proper respect. Nia slid off her chair to help, carrying the butter from the refrigerator with careful hands. Gabriel remained seated for a second, watching them move around the little kitchen with the ease of people who knew where everything belonged. It struck him then, not for the first time, that wealth had taught him convenience, but homes like this still understood ceremony better. The small kind. The kind that makes ordinary food feel like witness. Clara opened the bakery box, and the sweet warm scent of cornmeal and honey rose into the apartment, rich and simple and familiar enough to make Gabriel's eyes lower for a second. "That smells close," he said quietly. Clara cut generous squares, set one on his plate, one on Nia's, one on her own, then added a small dish of butter in the middle of the table as if this had always been the plan for the evening. The check remained beside the notebook, not hidden away, not flaunted, simply present, like a truth the room had agreed to make space for. Nia took a bite first. Her eyes widened. "This is really good." Gabriel looked at her with that same tired tenderness he had worn at school. "Your father would probably have opinions on the texture." Clara snorted softly. "Oh, he absolutely would." For a few minutes they ate and spoke in the easier way people do after a hard truth has been carried safely across the room. Marcus's jokes came back. His habit of humming while chopping onions. The way he wrote notes in margins like he was talking to whoever cooked after him. Gabriel told them about the church kitchen steam fogging the windows in winter, about Marcus slipping an extra dinner roll into his mother's sack and pretending it had been there by accident. Clara told him how Marcus once turned the last 3 eggs in the apartment into a breakfast that felt like a holiday, because Nia had a fever and needed cheering. The more they spoke, the less Marcus felt absent. He moved through the apartment in memory so vividly that the grief around him lost some of its sharpness and became what love often becomes after enough time has passed. Not lighter, exactly, but easier to hold without dropping everything else. When the plates were nearly empty and the radiator hissed again from the far wall, Gabriel folded his hands on the table and looked from Clara to Nia. "There is one more thing," he said. Clara's fingers paused around her mug of reheated tea. Nia looked up from the last corner of cornbread on her plate. Gabriel glanced once at Marcus's photograph, then at the notebook beside the check. "I do not want this kindness to end with your family simply being helped," he said. I wanted to keep feeding people the way Marcus intended. I spoke with the school's superintendent on my way here, and if you will allow it, I want to fund a lunch program in this district in his name so no child in that cafeteria ever has to choose between hunger and pride again. Clara did not answer immediately. Her hand remained wrapped around the warm ceramic mug, but her eyes had lifted to Marcus's photograph above the stove, as if this final question belonged to him before it belonged to her. The apartment had settled into evening now. The windows had gone dark except for the faint reflection of the kitchen light. The radiator breathed its uneven heat into the room, and the cornbread crumbs on the plates looked almost golden beside the check and the notebook resting near the center of the table. Nia sat very still, her chin barely above the edge of the tabletop, but her eyes moved carefully from her mother to Gabriel and back again. She had learned by now that the most important moments in life rarely sounded loud when they arrived. They sounded like this: quiet, careful, heavy with meaning. Clara set her mug down at last. "A lunch program?" she asked softly. Gabriel nodded. "In Marcus's name. Not as charity with his face printed on a banner and forgotten by spring. A real program. Daily meals. Quiet access. No child singled out. No child embarrassed. No paperwork handed to a parent in front of a crowded office. Just food. Ready, the way dignity should be." The words landed with the kind of precision that told Clara he had been thinking about them long before he came up the stairs. She looked at him for a long second, and something in her expression changed. Not suspicion this time. Not caution. Recognition. He was not offering money to soothe his conscience. He was trying to build a bridge back to the part of himself Marcus had once fed. Clara glanced down at the notebook, her thumb brushing the worn edge of the cover. "He would have liked the quiet part," she said. "Marcus never believed help should come with a spotlight." Gabriel's face softened. "Neither do I." Nia looked at the photograph, then back at the table. "Would kids get apples too?" she asked. Clara let out a small breath that almost became laughter. Gabriel smiled, tired and genuine. "Yes," he said. "Apples too." Nia considered that with the seriousness only a 9-year-old could give it, then nodded as if she had approved the structure of an important treaty. Clara's eyes filled again, but this time the tears did not seem born only from grief. They came from relief, from witness, from the strange holiness of seeing love return wearing a different coat. She pressed her palm flat against the notebook. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, we will allow it. But only if it stays what you said. No child singled out. No child made to feel small for being hungry." Gabriel straightened slightly in his chair, not with pride, but with promise. "You have my word." Clara held his gaze a moment longer, measuring it, then gave one small nod. It was enough. Something in the room released after that. Not dramatically, just a loosening. The kind that comes after a long-held breath is finally allowed to leave the body. Gabriel reached into his jacket again, this time taking out a simple folded document and sliding it across the table. "This is only the first draft," he said. "Nothing final without your input. If Marcus's name is on it, then his values should be too." Clara looked down at the pages, then up at him, and a faint smile touched her mouth through the last of her tears. "You really did know him," she said. Gabriel looked toward the photograph once more. "Not enough," he answered. The clock above the refrigerator ticked into the next minute. Somewhere outside, a siren passed far off and faded. Nia climbed down from her chair, walked over to the wall, and stood beneath Marcus's photograph with her small hands clasped behind her back. For a second, neither adult spoke. Then she looked up at her father's smiling face and said in a voice no bigger than the room, "Daddy, your kindness came back." Clara covered her mouth. Gabriel lowered his eyes. No one tried to improve the sentence. Nothing wiser was needed. A week later, the cafeteria looked the same until you noticed what had changed. The line moved a little easier. The trays were fuller. No form sat waiting by the register. No child hesitated at the fruit bowl and pretended they were not hungry enough. Above the serving counter, in neat, modest lettering, a small sign read, "The Marcus Brooks Table. Feed the person in front of you first." Nia walked in with her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders and saw Ethan already seated by the window. This time there were 2 trays on the table. He looked up as she approached, then pushed one gently toward the empty spot across from him. "I saved this seat," he said. His voice was still careful, still quiet, but no longer lost. Sunlight fell across the table, across the milk cartons and apple slices and the steam rising from warm soup and paper bowls. Nia sat down, smiled, and broke her cornbread in half anyway. Across the room, no one made an announcement. No one clapped. The miracle did not need applause. It lived in the ordinary now, which was where Marcus would have wanted it. And as the lunchroom noise rose around them, bright and human and full of small hungers being met, the light on the table held steady, and for the first time in a very long while, no child in that room had to eat alone.